This is the new M2 Apple MacBook Air, and I'm a big fan of Apple Silicon. I have an M1 Ultra Apple Mac Studio and a 16-inch M1 Max MacBook Pro. They've blown me away. Whether you like Apple or not, you must admit Apple Silicon is making waves and gaining some respect from the PC master race.
The M1 Ultra processor is just, man. Apple is just flexing on the rest of the industry at this point.
It's hard to deny that they're incredibly powerful, are extremely power efficient, and allow for some pretty astoundingly small form factors with fantastic battery life for the power that you get out of them. So after having a phenomenal experience with Apple Silicon, I couldn't help but see the M2 MacBook Air and think, I bet that could give a gaming laptop a run for its money. So I bought the $1,200 base model M2 MacBook Air, and I'll be putting it up against the Asus ROG Zephyrus G14, which comes in at a price of $1,650. So the question is, does the G14 smoke this M2 MacBook Air, or will the MacBook Air give the G14 a run for its money, or at least make it sweat a little bit like I think it will? Who do you think will win? Let's dive in and compare some benchmarks, share some pros and cons, and then figure out who is a good fit for each of these laptops. And of course, this is YouTube. If you decide to purchase any of these laptops, please consider using the links in the description, as they do help support the channel. One of the first tests that we ran was the Cinebench single core score, and the M2 MacBook Air slightly beat the G14 with a score that's just shy of 4% higher, and that's regardless of either of them being plugged into power or not. So far, it's not looking so great for the G14. The new M2 MacBook Air is shockingly thin. It's essentially as thick as an iPad if you put a hinge screen on top of it. It has a fantastic metal construction that has an excellent fit, finish, and feel. It does ditch the wedge design of a previous MacBook Air, but this design looks clean and minimal in design in a good way. It also is about half as thick as the Zephyrus G14 and a pound lighter. The ROG Zephyrus G14 is made mainly out of plastic, but it doesn't feel cheap. There is a metal plate at the bottom, which I imagine is there to dissipate all that heat, and the design is more expressive with a fun dot design on the back of the screen and vents all along the sides facing away from you. And to be fair, I'm on a big matte white colored tech kick lately, so I actually really love this. Both passed a one finger test when opening up the lid, but the G14 does have some screen wiggle compared to the MacBook Air, but it's honestly not too bad, nor is it nearly as bad as many other laptops out there. As a whole, it does seem like the MacBook Air is built much better with a more premium feel, but that's more a testament to how good Apple's hardware is than it being anything about the G14 being subpar, because I don't think the G14 feels cheap or bad at all. For battery life, I like to test out the monitor at the max brightness, especially for displays with around 500 nits, because I just generally find them to be a bit dim for my taste. For the first test, I put on a 20-hour YouTube video, which I think is pretty close to emulating the average usage, like emails, using the internet, watching videos, or whatever else, and I let it run until the battery died. The G14 lasted just shy of 5.5 hours, while the Air lasted for 8 hours and 45 minutes. The second test, I ran the Unigen Heaven benchmark until the battery died, again with the max screen brightness, and the G14 lasted only 45 minutes, which is shocking, and the Air lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Whew, the G14 got smoked here again. Now, MacBooks are known to have the best trackpads out there. Its glass materials and haptic feedback provide a smooth experience with an excellent click. I will say that the sound of it is a bit less weighty than on the 16-inch M1 MacBook Pro I have, and the haptics may be a little bit less intense, but you really have to pay attention. I think it's mostly the sound that makes it seem weaker. The G14 also has an excellent big glass trackpad that feels fantastic to move your finger across. The one thing that does stink about it is the wedge design, so the top does not depress, but the bottom does. Regardless of the laptop, the wedge design consistently feels out of place amongst what could overall feel like a premium experience for a laptop. It just feels less precise and more spongy compared to what Apple has going on. Both laptops have some solid space for your palms to rest on compared to some that make your hands fall off the edge, making that carpal tunnel knock out the door. The MacBook Air's keyboard is fantastic with a firm resistance and a confident bump that feels great when you fully press down. Shockingly, I think the feel of the Air's keyboard is even better than on the 16-inch M1 Max MacBook Pro that I have. And the G14 is surprising because it's quite similar in feel to the MacBook Air, but with a little bit more travel. They're both really great to type on, and they both have backlit keys, but the G14 keys have more of a ROG gamer font, which may not look as nice to some, and the keycaps themselves are more yellow and iridescent compared to the frame, which I'm not as big of a fan of. It looks like mismatched colors more than a confident contrast than what you have on the MacBook Air. The results were interesting when I tested out the Cinebench multi-core scores. The MacBook Air had a 37% lower score than the G14. Ooh, that's actually pretty brutal. Things were a bit more interesting when I plugged them into power. The G14 increased in performance by a little over 9%, but the MacBook Air decreased by performance by about 5%. Surely that's a mistake, right? What's crazy is how easy it was for the MacBook Air to thermal throttle, which resulted in scores far lower than what was eventually accepted. I had to wait and let the MacBook Air cool down before every single test, and despite waiting, that was the best score, so quite unfortunate. As for the I/O, the MacBook Air does gain a little bit from the previous generation with the MagSafe power adapter coming back, which leaves 2 USB ports available. In the past, you had to charge over one of the USB ports, leaving you with only one free, which is frustrating. The G14 shines here with 2 USB-C ports, 2 USB-A ports, a full-size HDMI port, and a micro SD card slot. I would have preferred a full-size SD card slot since many creatives use them, but it's at least nice to have. There's no Ethernet port, which would have been nice for gaming, and the barrel plug for power is in a peculiar and inconvenient spot right smack in the middle of the left side, which just doesn't make sense to me. At least put it in the far left of that side or the back of the computer. Now as for the cameras, the G14 has a 720p webcam compared to the 1080p webcam on the MacBook Air. This is what the 1080p webcam looks like on the M2 MacBook Air and what the microphone sounds like. How do you think it sounds and looks? And this is what the 720p webcam looks like and what the microphone sounds like. Hopefully the microphone sounds better than the way that this looks. It looks like someone smudged a whole bunch of Vaseline on it, but there's no Vaseline on it. It's kind of gloomy and stuff. Thankfully, both of their mics have a solid sound. Overall, I think the MacBook Air has a better camera and it's less bloomy compared to the G14. Perhaps what makes up for the G14's bad camera is the usage of Windows Hello, which allows you to open up your laptop, scan your face, and then log in. It would be awesome if Apple added something like this. They already have Face ID in other devices, and that's fantastic, so why don't they just add it to this computer, especially if they have a notch? At least we have a Touch ID fingerprint scanner, which is also quite nice. Now, when testing out Geekbench, the MacBook Air came in 17% lower in single-core scores and 8% lower in multi-core scores. For OpenCL Compute, the G14 was 3.5 times higher, and for Vulkan and Metal Compute, the MacBook Air was 47% lower. This is starting to look ugly for the Air, and just not how I expected. Jeez. The screens on both of these laptops look pretty great. They nearly have the same resolution, with the MacBook Air getting 64 pixels to account for the area that the menu bar sits next to the notch. As a whole though, I think the G14 looks like it has a slightly brighter screen despite both of the companies claiming 500 nits of brightness, and it has a less warm looking white balance. The G14 does have a matte finish display, which does a great job of avoiding glare, but it causes the blacks to not look as dark as on the MacBook Air's glossy screen. As a whole, I do prefer the G14 display more often than not, and that's probably because of how bright the screen gets and the 120Hz refresh rate. But I will say, I do think macOS seems to scale things a bit better, making things like text look a bit smoother. As for speakers, I'm an audio engineer, so I have to be a little bit extra, so let's listen to some samples. Please wear headphones or earbuds in both ears for the best experience here. As for how loud they can get, both laptops hover around 80 decibels. I noticed that the G14 has less clarity in the high end and muffled low mids. This is likely to help add a feeling of more bass when you can't get a lot of bass in a form factor so small. Alternatively, the MacBook Air doesn't have a lot of bass either, but manages to have a very, very clear sound where nothing feels congested or muffled. One interesting thing though is that the MacBook Air has speakers under the keyboard with vents that sit within the hinge of the body that shoots into the display and reflects back at you. This design is pretty neat and clean, but the placement of these vents isn't that far apart, resulting in a very narrow stereo sound. The G14 on the other hand has some pretty stellar stereo spread for a laptop, but their speaker grills are quite prominent. Let's listen to a sample again for that stereo spread. There's a wah-wah sound that moves between the left and right on this track, so listen for that. Now, when you're using these laptops, you need good software on them to get stuff done, and when you do it, you have to find the best price. That's where this video sponsor SoftwareKeep comes in. SoftwareKeep only sells 100% genuine Microsoft software, is a Microsoft certified gold partner, and is based in America. So they're not one of those sketchy websites that I'm always afraid to use my credit card on. Because of their credibility, they qualify to be a sponsor with me. They have genuine lifetime and subscription products from a single license all the way up to enterprise levels for Microsoft Office, Microsoft 365, Windows, various types of antivirus software, VMware, and more. And yes, there are options available for both Windows and Mac users. They value support, so they have real people there to help you 24/7 throughout the process. They also have a lifetime product guarantee and a secure checkout with various payment options, including a buy now, pay later option. Once you check out, you'll get your codes in 15 minutes or less. What's amazing is that they gave the This Is Tech Today community a 20% off discount for the entire store if you use the code TTT20. So make sure to click the link in the description whenever you need to purchase some software and save with the coupon code TTT20. Thanks so much to Software Keep for sponsoring this portion of the video. I actually need a Windows code myself for an upcoming build I'm working on, so it's perfect. I'm actually going to order it right now. Unigine Heaven was an interesting test because the G14 will perform better on the plug than off the plug, with an improvement of about 19% when plugged in. For the MacBook Air, it consistently got worse scores when plugged in by about 2 to 5%, which just continued to confuse me. I think this is less about performance changes based upon being plugged in, but more on thermal throttling. That was just consistently an issue throughout all of these benchmarks. Every single time I ran another test immediately after the first test, I just got a lower score. I simply could not test the MacBook Air without being concerned about thermal throttling, so that's not great. When I plugged in the G14 into power, I did experience an 18.5% increase in average frames per second. The Air had no difference whether or not you plugged it in or not. Comparing the G14 plugged in and the MacBook Air, well, the G14 had almost a 63.5% higher average frames per second, and that matched the results in the overall score for Heaven as well. I guess what they say is you don't really use Mac for gaming? Now, it's neat that the MacBook Air doesn't have fans. It's truly a solid state device, but something seems to be wrong with the M2 series of chips. They seem to be clocked too high, and without much cooling built into it at all, it cannot handle the resulting heat, so it throttles aggressively. The plus side of this design is that there's no fan noise compared to the G14's fans that will ramp up and will reach a volume of about 60 decibels when pushed. Interestingly, the MacBook Air doesn't feel nearly as hot to the touch compared to the G14. The Air can still reach a surface temperature of about 114 degrees in the center area right above the keyboard, but you're not likely to touch there. The G14 can feel quite hot to the touch above the keyboard where you do interact with buttons like the volume or power button, and can reach surface temperatures of 126 degrees. Even the trackpad can reach a surface temperature of 117 degrees, which may be a bit uncomfortable. In comparison, the M1 series chips didn't seem to throttle nearly as often and aggressively as the M2 chips, which is a very disappointing experience, but that may provide an opportunity for you to get a better performing M1 chip at a cheaper price, or a good argument to save your money for a 14-inch MacBook Pro if you need more performance. Since I'm a creator, I edit videos, so one of the simplest ways for me to tangibly see the difference in performance is by exporting a video. So I use a 2-minute and 11-second long 4K video shot in Sony codec from my FX3 mirrorless camera. This codec tends to be one of the more demanding codecs. For both laptops, they handle typical editing adjustments like adding color correction and creative LUTs and scrubbing along the timeline quite well. That makes quick editing surprisingly possible on the Air, but once you start adding advanced image correction into the equation like noise reduction, both laptops start lagging on playback. To be fair, this has even caused my Mac Pro to struggle at times, so it's not surprising. The MacBook Air consistently hit 4 minutes and 45 seconds on every first run export we made in various situations, regardless of being plugged in or not, but subsequent exports hit 5 minutes and 12 seconds and then 6 minutes and 26 seconds respectively. Alternatively, the G14 hit 2 minutes and 26 seconds off battery and 1 minute and 53 seconds when plugged in, and remained consistent in back-to-back exports. Now here's the thing, the general perception has been that the base model M2 MacBook Air with 256GB of storage doesn't perform as well as the 512GB storage in higher models. I was actually gonna pull a Princess Bride and say,
Then why are you smiling? Because I know something you don't know. And what is that? I am not left-handed.
And pull an upgraded model out of this envelope with upgraded specs that match the RAM, storage, and price of the G14, with the idea that we're gonna make the G14 look terrible. But here's the thing, there's not much of a difference at all between both models of MacBook Airs in our tests outside of disk speeds. The disk speeds for the Air increased from a read of 1468 and a write of 1490 up to 2338 and 2930 respectively. These improvements do sound like a big jump and do match the speeds of the G14, but in practice, I'm just not seeing much of a difference at all other than moving files around. In some cases, our benchmarks came out worse than the base model, and we kept retesting because we thought maybe we're hitting thermal throttling. The thing is, even waiting a while between each test did not seem to help. Sometimes the upgraded MacBook Air came out with a lower score regardless of what we did. And since we're talking about surprises, we can't ignore the G14's Mux switch, which bypasses the internal GPU and uses the discrete GPU. Supposedly that results in a higher performance.
There's something I ought to tell you. Tell me. I'm not left-handed either.
But in practice, the difference isn't that much. Throughout this test, there were many times I would get less than a percentage of difference, and at most, a 4% increase in performance. The downside of the G14's Mux switch is that it creates a ton of instability that causes the display to bork out, either displaying briefly and then fading out, or simply not turning on at all, even though you're able to interact with the OS otherwise. And this is not a one-off issue. You can find a number of people encountering this same issue online. So I really don't think enabling the Mux switch is worth it, especially for gaming, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So overall, the Air got smoked in the review, for some people. So the question is, who are these laptops for? I think it's clear that the MacBook Air, while advertised in a way that says it can do a lot for performance tasks, isn't meant for sustained performance tasks. It's capable of doing them for short bursts, which can include some casual video and image editing, but sustained heavy loads like exporting long video files really shows its limits in this area if you're even the type to do such a thing. The Air would be an excellent laptop for someone that is a front office assistant, a secretary, a writer, or a student that writes papers, studies, surfs the webs, and answers emails, which is honestly the majority of people. And the outstanding battery life further emphasizes how it will provide a fantastic experience for these kinds of people in a high quality form factor and build. That's also a reason why it starts at 256 gigabytes of storage. Ask anyone who runs IT for a school or many other companies. Many of these jobs lean on cloud-based services like Google Docs, and it's purely a work computer. In these cases, the need for a lot of storage space is relatively small, so it provides a convenient marketing point for Apple to say it starts at $1,200, or actually even $1,100 for education, and it gives a lower entry price point for mass deployment to teachers and employees. Now, if you want to do all the things I just listed for the MacBook Air, but want to add more sustained performance-based tasks on your laptop, the G14 is a phenomenal laptop that I've come to like a lot. The fact that it performs so well running off of battery power compared to many other gaming laptops, which completely tank in performance, is quite refreshing. That makes it at least a bit more like an Air in terms of consistent performance off the charter compared to its peers. Yes, the battery life while gaming is abysmal, but over 5 hours of battery life for normal use is perfectly usable and will likely work for most people throughout the day, as most people have access to a power outlet at some point throughout the day. However, it is fair to say that it's nice to not have battery anxiety. So what about gaming? Well, if you're using a Mac, you know you're not using it for gaming, and the Heaven scores seem to emphasize why. The G14 though, it can frickin' game. If you're a student that games, or someone that is able to use your work laptop for personal use as well, or you need a main computer that can also game, the G14 is an extremely capable and fun laptop. This thing can solidly game, even if it's off the plug, which is nice. Now, remember how I said there was something weird about the Mux Switch in gaming? Well, gaming performance was worse, especially when running off the battery. I'm not so sure it's all that useful, especially with the stability issues it brings. So, what would I choose? Well, if I had to pick one, I would pick the G14. The MacBook Air just isn't for me, but also I have a unique situation where I have an M1 Ultra Mac Studio and a 16-inch M1 Max MacBook Pro at my disposal. They meet and exceed my specific needs for performance-based tasks like making these videos. So the G14 is my pick simply because it's novel and fun. But if I didn't have any of these computers, I'd save up my money and get a 14-inch M1 MacBook Pro. With everything in mind, if you want to pick up either of these laptops, there are links available in the description or right here. Using those links helps support the channel. I'd love to know your thoughts on this review, which one you get and why. Make sure to respect each other in the comments and let people have their preferences. They're allowed to, and you don't always know their needs or situation, so be kind. That's what I expect out of this community. Full disclosure, I did purchase all these computers with my own money, and Asus and Apple have no editorial control over this video, and they're seeing it at the same time that you are. Thanks for watching This Is Tech Today. Until next time.